In this video, we're going to animate the entire scene, which is comprised of the candy box, the candy bar, spoon bowl, and the plane or background element that is appearing inside a viewport. We'll start by introducing the camera gate. The camera gate is located inside any of the viewports. In this particular one, I'm using the perspective. And under the word show, you'll see a box with a gray rectangle inside of it below the OW here. When I click on that, it gives me the camera gate. And that just helps me define the actual composition window of the animation. And that will allow me to zoom in and change the view if need be. Once I've got the gate, I'm going to select all the components of the model with the exception of the light. And I'm going to group it by hitting Command G. And then in the right hand corner of the channel box, I'll change the group name to All Components, and I'll center the pivot. Now I'm going to introduce keyframes. I'll start by kind of setting up the comp I'd like at the beginning of the timeline, making sure that in the lower right hand corner of Maya, just next to the little orange man with the gear above his shoulder, I click on the two hooked arrows to introduce the virtual keyframe function inside of Maya. With it selected, the background appears as being red. I'm going to go to Rotate Y in the channel box. Right-clicking on it, I will choose Key Selected. Now I'll go to the end of the timeline using the VCR control. And at frame 120, I will change Rotate Y from 0 to 360. And if I were to preview this with the buttons on the VCR control, I can now preview what I have. Now, I've got an issue with where I'd like the center of this composition to be. I'll stop the animation, and if I hit W on the keyboard, I can see that the center of my composition is over here. And the plane on which everything is taking place is not distributed very evenly underneath the model. So I'll go to the top view now, and I'll start by moving the plane more centrally located to the model itself. And then I'll hit the up arrow to relocate where my pivot is. And I'm going to change the pivot, move it closer to the central part of the model itself. I'll hold down D on the keyboard, and then I'll use the cursor to where I would like it to rotate around from. So now if I return to my perspective view again, and I start to manipulate that viewport, going back to the beginning of the timeline, and if I were to play it from here now, I can see I've kind of located where I'd like to render from. This could use a little bit of refinement. So while it's previewing, I can hold down the Option key in the middle mouse. In this case, I can pan or zoom back, in and out, whatever I might do, or rotate the actual perspective plane to get the composition I want. Now that I roughly have what I want, I'm going to preview it with Play Blast. So I'll stop the animation process. At the top of the user interface, I'll go to Window, and I'll choose Play Blast Attributes, and in there it's already set for time range, which is the duration of the 120 frames, and the format is insignificant because we're not going to save this file, and I've got the scale down to half the size, and I'll hit Apply, and it'll generate a quick animation for me, allowing me to confirm that none of my content is off the edges of the composition. So this is just a rough way of approving the composition before you take the time to render out each frame. Once I have that, I'll close this out and not save it. Now, if in the event you're previewing your animation and it's going excessively fast, you'll want to go to Window, and you'll want to go to Settings and Preferences and Preferences. And if you were to go to Time Slider At the bottom of the window where it says playback, you'll want to make sure that playback speed is 24 frames per second. Now that I have the animation set the way I want, one last thing I'll do is go to Arnold, open Arnold Render View, and I'll just drag through my timeline to confirm the lighting is what I want as well. So I'll just drop it intermittently and then take a look. And it all looks pretty good. So now I'm ready to set my frame range and then render to my project folder. First thing I'll do is go to the attributes. The attributes are located on the top of the user interface to the left of the hypershade, which appears as a little kind of a blue pool ball. It has a gear in the right hand corner. When I click on that, the first thing I want to do is name that. And I'm going to change the image format to a TIFF. And moving down the timeline to frame animation extension, I'll choose the very last choice. That will allow me to introduce it to After Effects afterwards and make the MP4. Now the frame range will be starting at 1. It will end at 120. And it will render every 2 frames. And that is so we can create a very small file that will be able to be embedded in our final PDF, and it'll also expedite the render process from Maya, making it much quicker. Now, if in the event you're doing this now at home because of our little issues with the coronavirus, the default setting here is 960 by 540. If you have an issue rendering your composition at this size, you can knock that down to something smaller like 320 by 240 if you choose. I would suggest, though, try 640 by 480, and then if you're still having issues, try 320 by 240. Now that I have that set, I'm ready to go ahead and to render. I'll hold down my space bar. I'm going to go to Render, and I'm going to the Render Sequence Attributes. And in the render sequence attributes, I'm going to confirm that the perspective camera is chosen, make sure that that is correct. If it's a top view or an orthographic view, you won't get the composition you want. And then all we need to do is go to Alternate Output File Location, click on the folder, and direct that to the image folder inside of your project. Once you've done that, all you need to do is click on Render Sequence, and your animation will be rendered as a series of .tifs that are composited in After Effects in the following tutorial.